Go to Labor MP Matt Thistlethwaite, one of our regulars, to chat about news of the day. Firstly, Matt, if I could ask you about the RBA governor's comments about the economy. He seems to be saying that the worst of it's over and that the economy is faring quite strongly. Surely that's good news.
Well, Annalise, I think what the RBA governor's been highlighting for some months now is the fact that the RBA can't do this all on its own, that monetary policy isn't enough, and they're asking the government to come up with other measures, notably fiscal measures, to try and stimulate the economy. And he's foreshadowed that there may be further rate cuts needed. We're at unprecedented low levels now, and the lack of action and the lack of a plan by this government to stimulate the Australian economy, to get consumption growing again, to get wages growing at reasonable levels again, has caused alarm for the Reserve Bank, and that's why he made that speech. So I think that the government needs to come up with a plan to stimulate our economy, to get growth and wages going again.
The government's announced $100 billion over 10 years. Nearly half of that, about $47 billion, is going to be in the pipeline in the next 4 years. Isn't this on the states if they're not investing in infrastructure? Well,
you know, the government's been talking about infrastructure projects for the last 6 years, but they've actually done very few of them. None of them appear to be shovel-ready. Some of the announcements that they've made in the last budget don't come in till 2026-27, and this is the point that the Reserve Bank Governor's been making for some months now, that you need to bring forward that infrastructure allocation that's set off into the next 5 or 6 years, bring it forward in the next couple of years and get those projects going now. That will stimulate government investment in the economy, it will ensure that people have jobs, and it will produce productivity-enhancing infrastructure that will unclog our cities and make sure that Australia has a more productive economy. And they're all comments that Labor supports. That's what we've been saying to the government for some months now. Bring forward some of this infrastructure and we'll support you in the parliament.
That is quite a significant infrastructure spend, though, and comparatively more than what Labor was spending in previous years. Isn't this on the states to get the shovels in the ground? If the money's there from the federal government for things like the East-West Link in Victoria and the airport in Sydney, this is on the state governments to get the money there moving.
Well, look, aside from the Sydney Airport project, I don't know of any major infrastructure projects that are actually occurring at the moment that are being funded by the federal government. And that's the point that the Reserve Bank's been making for some months now, that we need to look at some of these projects that are allocated in the budget but don't come into effect for another 5 or 6 years. There's a road project in Peter Dutton's electorate. The funding is allocated for 2026-27. Now, when you're talking about trying to stimulate the economy now so that we avoid potential headwinds into the future of the slowing growth internationally and slowing growth domestically, you need to bring forward those infrastructure projects, make sure that they are ready to go. And that's a matter for the government. If they were serious about it, then they'd sit down with the states through a COAG process and say, listen, what are your top 3 or 4 projects? Let's work on getting them ready to go in the next year.
If we can turn to the Prime Minister's speech at the United Nations, he was speaking about Australia's climate investment, saying that we invest more in renewable energies per capita than most other countries in the world. Do you think that the Prime Minister's right in saying that it's the media that's been putting a spin on Australia not being climate friendly?
No, I don't, Annalise. I think that, you know, the proof is in the fact that 100,000 Australians marched in the streets last week to express their anger at this government's lack of action when it comes to climate change. I think the average Australian knows that this government's not doing enough when it comes to climate change. Let's face it, when Tony Abbott was elected, when this government was put in place, they dismantled the project that Labor put in place to reduce emissions that was actually working. As a result, emissions are now going up again. They tried to get rid of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation that finances renewable energy projects where they can't get commercial funding. They've tried to reduce the renewable energy target, and they've had this ongoing war about climate change within their party that's resulted in 16 different energy policies. The Australian people know that this government is not doing enough on climate change. It was quite pathetic to see the Prime Minister making excuses in the UN on the day that the UN announced an historic report that indicates that because of sea level rise, you're looking at the prospect of extreme weather events happening on an annual basis in a country like Australia.
The Prime Minister has been quite clear, though, that we are meeting our Paris targets in a canter. We are investing more per capita than any other country really in the world in renewable energy. Why is it all in Australia when we have such a small proportion of the global emissions in the world?
Well, look, it's important that all nations take action on climate change, and it's important that Australia is part of that and at the negotiating table. And as I said, I think the average Australian believes and understands that this government's not doing enough on climate change. A lot of the action that's occurring in Australia, in my view, is not because of the government's policies or insistence. It's because Australian households and Australian businesses see the benefit in renewable energy, particularly rooftop solar, and they also see that it's the right thing to do by their kids. They believe that climate change is occurring, and they believe that where possible, as individuals, we should take action to reduce our carbon emissions. But I don't believe that they think that the government is doing enough when they talk about reducing the renewable energy target, getting rid of ARENA or the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and getting rid of mechanisms that were reducing emissions.
Do you think, then why didn't people vote for Labor at the election? You had a very clear climate policy, a very clear climate focus. Was it just the fact your climate policies weren't costed?
No, I don't believe that's the case. But we accept that we didn't win the election. I think it's probably more to do with the fact, Annalise, that people vote on a whole host of issues that they take into consideration when they vote, and climate change was simply one of those. There's no doubt that Labor's tax reform policies were quite bold, and they may have, particularly with the government scare campaign, left a few people uncertain. So I think that there's a mix of policies that come into these decisions that people make. However, it won't change Labor's resolve to make sure that we're taking stronger action on climate change, that we listen to the Australian public and try and do all we can to put in place mechanisms to reduce carbon emissions, to boost the uptake of renewable energy, and ultimately use that as a means of reducing electricity prices in Australia, which have been prohibitive for business. We saw Anthony Pratt in the US saying that he set up that factory there that Scott Morrison was at a couple of days ago because of electricity costs in Australia. Now, that's on the government. That's the government's fault for not coming up with a policy to reduce electricity prices and make business investment in Australia more attractive. So we'll have a suite of policies that reduce emissions, that boost renewable energy and get electricity prices down.
And just finally, Canberra's passed new laws on cannabis to allow 2 plants here. Are you going to be buying a few plants for your place in Canberra?
No. Look, that's a matter for the ACT legislature. Their own parliament. They've made this decision. It does reflect an international trend, Annalise, of governments throughout the world, and I think the Canadian government is an example. Some states in the United States of approaching these issues as a health and harm minimisation issue rather than a criminal law approach, and trying to ensure that you're using resources to tackle drug trafficking at the high end, and making sure that funds are invested in harm minimisation, particularly around education of the Australian public about the effects of using drugs, ensuring that people don't drive whilst they're using drugs, but also ensuring that we have adequate treatment services to help people who get addicted. And I think that all of the evidence internationally is that approach works better than a simple just say no and lock them up approach.
So would you support a Commonwealth approach to decriminalising cannabis then? Because there is some question about the conflict between the Commonwealth law and the ACT law.
Yeah, look, this is an issue that I think that the ACT government is going to have to sit down with the AFP and work through. At a federal level, there's no proposal to change the laws, and it's certainly not Labor's policy to change the laws at the moment. And if there was a proposal, I believe that it's something that should go through a thorough investigative process through some form of parliamentary committee so that we do hear the pros and cons before, and so that MPs like myself can make informed decisions on issues such as this.
Fair enough. Matt Thistlethwaite, thank you for your time.
My pleasure, Annalise. Thank you.